Good morning. My Bible's open to Hebrews 6. Would you turn there with me, please? This passage in Hebrews 6, verse 19, verse 18 and 19 particularly, these are very famous verses, particularly after a guy comes for a gospel meeting and starts every sermon right here. But it's not just us that are familiar with these texts. These passages meant a lot, even to the earliest Christians. In fact, we have an account from one of the early Christians in about AD 170 who wrote about wearing jewelry and symbols of Christianity. I made a note. The Christian teacher Clement of Alexander said the anchor is an appropriate device for a Christian's jewelry. Let our seals be either a dove or a fish or the ship's anchor. And that comes from this text, doesn't it? Verse 18, by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we have fled. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. And we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. I have an opportunity to just work through some of what the Hebrew writer is talking about in Hebrews 6, and I'd like to do some of that now with you this morning, because in some ways, and maybe as I read that you're wondering if there's a connection to the supper, in some ways I wonder if this isn't one of the most Lord's Supperiest passages in all of the Bible, because of what the Hebrew writer is talking about, what he wants his audience to think about, and what we need to be thinking about right now. I really love the book of Hebrews a lot. It's a book about perseverance. It's a book written to some people who are thinking about quitting on Christianity. Sometimes we kind of narrow the focus of Hebrews and we'll say something about this book is about people who are thinking about quitting Christianity and going back to Judaism. And of course, since none of us have ever, I'm going to guess, been part of a synagogue, been part of Judaism, then that kind of pushes the book away. I'm not thinking about going back to Judaism. Why do I need to read the book of Hebrews? But that unnecessarily limits the scope of what the Hebrew writer is talking about. We're not even sure that they were going to try to go back to Judaism. What we know is that these people were being persecuted. It had just started, and it was hard. And some of these folks were saying, I'm not sure I signed up for this. And does Christianity really work? Can I connect with God in this way anyway? What am I doing? Maybe I'll just chuck the whole thing. And when we start looking at Hebrews through that lens, suddenly it begins to have great power, because most nearly everybody at some point has wondered, is this really what I need to do? Is this what I should be about? Do I want to stay with this Christianity thing? And so the Hebrew writer is trying to help them with some of that here. Look at verse 11. We desire that each of you, Hebrews 6:11, that each one of you should show the same earnestness to have full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish or imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Got to hold on. Don't give up. What the Hebrew writer does then is he turns to an example, to an illustration of somebody who held on. And that example, verse 13, is Abraham. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus, Abraham, verse 15, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. The Hebrew writer cites somebody who had to endure, who had to persevere, had to hold on for a long time. Verse 15, patiently waited. I'm not very good at that, are you? Go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, get your license renewed, pull that number down. I'm number 48. I'm looking at that number, and about the time the lady leans in the microphone, she says, number 3, serving number 3. Wow. There's an amusement park just south of here you may have heard about. If one of your friends comes to see you and it's the July 4th weekend and they say, hey, let's go to Disney. We'll see everything and ride every ride. What are you saying about that? We go to Disney today, it's going to be a lot of waiting. We're not good at that patiently waiting thing. But that's exactly what we're doing today. Remember, Paul says, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. We're in the until. We're waiting for Jesus to come. And sometimes not very patiently. But the Hebrew writer says that God did something to help Abraham while he waited. He did what? He made a promise, verse 13. And not only did He make a promise, then He swore by Himself. Made a promise, and then made that promise even more sure by taking an oath. Maybe you've seen that bumper sticker that says, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And in some ways I appreciate that sentiment, but the Hebrew writer says, God said it, then He swore an oath to confirm it, and now it's settled. The Hebrew writer says that Abraham had to wait patiently, but that he was sustained by knowing what God had promised He would do. And so, verse 16, people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God decided to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of His purpose, He guaranteed it with an oath. God really wanted Abraham to know, if you hold on, you will receive the reward. I'm not pulling your leg. I'm not playing games. I'm serious about this. I will give you what I have promised you. One scholar said, the Hebrew writer uses every resource at his disposal to show the lengths to which God has gone in order to assure the people that the promise of salvation, the promises in Abraham, would be absolutely reliable. And so the promises to the Hebrew recipients are just as reliable. That's what we need to focus on. Hold fast. Don't quit. Don't give up. God has promised, and in those promises, we find our hope. We don't lose heart. We continue to hope. And so that takes us to those verses that are so famous. By two unchangeable things, verse 18, the promise of God, the oath God has taken, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. And we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone. Our hope stretches into heaven because that's where Jesus is. He's our forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So we're going to take these emblems this morning, and if we focus on what the Hebrew writer is talking about, it will fill us up with new hope and new strength again. Because as we take some time for self-examination, we're going to realize our hope is not found in ourselves, in what we can do. If taking the Lord's Supper causes you to draw yourself up in self-righteousness, you're doing it wrong. Taking the Lord's Supper causes us to realize that we are weak and frail, and that we do not always do what the Lord wants us to do. Our hope can't be in ourselves. And our hope can't even really be in others. Has somebody else ever made a promise to you and broken their word? We all know the pain of that. What's our hope in? Our hope is in the promises of God. Our hope is in what God has told us. He will give us that crown of life. Our hope is in what God is doing to fulfill those promises in our life. Our hope is in the working of God right now, because our hope is in God. Did you see it, verse 18? It's impossible for God to lie. We hope in the very nature and character of God, who made promises so great and grand. It took His Son coming here and dying for us to make them real and to bring them to pass. And God did that because He had promised. let's think about those promises and the wonder of God's grace and how sure we are that God has worked, is working, and will continue to work to bring us home to Him. In this, we have hope that anchors our soul.